Audiobook and Sapience Institute present Nihilism and Islam, My Poison and My Cure. Written by Yusuf Ponders. Narrated by David Williamson. For my daughter, may Allah keep her firm upon Islam and make her a blessing for the Ummah. For my mother, brother, and sister, may Allah guide them and those they love to the religion of Islam. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the Merciful, the Giver of Mercy. All praise and gratitude are due to God, the Lord of everything that exists. May God's peace and blessings be upon His final prophet and messenger, Muhammad. Preface. Who am I, and why do I care? Many people around the world suffer from depression, and some opt for suicide to escape their anguish. Through my work on nihilism, I have had numerous individuals reach out to me and express their suffering from these issues. Nihilism is a very personal topic for me. It's not only a lived experience, but I have also witnessed the suffering it has inflicted on those close to me, who have fallen prey to the same anguish. I know what it feels like to look out into the world and see nothing but dust. To stare into a black abyss, to lay your suffering and hardship out in front of you, and to see no rhyme or reason as to why it exists, or why you had to go through so much pain. I too have felt my heart being crushed within my chest, under the weight of my despair due to the apparent meaninglessness of all my experiences. I have suffered from severe depression and social anxiety, which led me to run away and later to isolate myself for many years. My motivation for wanting to tackle this subject is connected to my story, and so I wanted to share it with you first, so that you can understand me as a writer and what brought me here, to discuss this incredibly depressing subject. So, who am I? I was born in the north of England, in a small town on the border of Manchester. My mother came here from Poland when she was 3 years old, and my father moved here from Glasgow after he met my mother. They had 3 children, first me, then my brother, and then my sister. We were raised as Catholics, baptized, received Holy Communion, went to a Catholic school, church, and Polish Sunday school. We grew up on a council estate and were far from rich. My mom was a great provider. She worked a lot in restaurants, doing double shifts, and making sure we had what we needed. My dad, not so much. He was a heroin addict who was constantly in and out of prison. He came from a rough place, and I suppose this motivated him to want to toughen me and my brother up. He made us watch horror movies from a very young age. Everything from The Exorcist, The Omen, to The Children of the Corn. When he was around and not incapacitated from the heroin, he was obsessed with making us brave. My mother, in contrast to him, was very nurturing, loving, and kind. This would cause tension, as my dad believed this would make us too soft. The world was a dangerous place, and we needed to be men. When I was 9 years old, my dad passed away from a heroin overdose, and 3 days later my little sister was born. April 1st, 1998. A date that is imprinted in my memory. The day my dad died, and the day that my tension with God began. My brother and I were in our beds, pretending we were still asleep. It was a school day, and we figured that everyone had just forgotten. We could hear a lot of commotion downstairs, so we hid under our sheets, barely able to contain our laughter. The excitement of potentially getting a day off school filled us with glee. Our family from Glasgow had come down to visit us, and we were excited at the thought of getting to spend more time with them. At 9 a.m., when we knew we had officially missed school registration, my brother and I skipped down the stairs with big smiles on our face, ready to embrace our day off with the family. However, When we got to the bottom, we noticed there were a lot of strangers in the house. With my family were policemen, paramedics, and my neighbors. I was confused. I couldn't quite figure out what was happening. I recall seeing my pregnant mother crying, and with one of my aunties we were taken away from the living room so we couldn't see what was happening. We sat on the stairs and my mother was unable to speak because of the tears. She had to tell us something but couldn't quite say it. Eventually someone said, "Your dad has passed away." I'm sure other things were said, but to be honest, this is all I can remember. I remember not really knowing how I was supposed to react, and just looking at my mum being distressed. I wasn't quite sure how to process it. It didn't feel real. We were told one of my uncles was driving down from Glasgow to take us to Scotland, and that we needed to go pack some clothes. I went to go and get ready, and while I was packing and I was on my own, not thinking about how I was supposed to react, reality began to sink in. I began to get angry at God. I recall complaining to him and asking him why he would do such a thing to us. My dad was 33 when he died. As I write this now, I am the same age he was when he passed. It didn't make sense to me. We took his body to Scotland to be buried next to my grandmother, his mum. I recall attending the wake and having the opportunity to stand by my dad's body, holding his cold hands and speaking to him. I remember asking him to wake up and kissing him on his cold forehead. I remember the strange smell of the chemicals they put on dead bodies. I refused to leave his side for a while, and people came in and out the room to give their respects. The priest came to give a sermon by the coffin, and I recall looking at my mum, holding my little sister who had just been born not long after my dad had died. I remember them lowering the coffin into the ground, and I remember screaming at them not to do it. I remember it all very vividly, the colors, the people, the place, the emotions. It wasn't an easy thing to experience. We then continued for many years after this, to experience much more death in our family and with close friends. We had loss because of alcoholism, suicide, drug abuse, and old age. Eventually, we stopped going to church, and I went to a secular school. Religion became a distant thing to me. I consumed media and played games, which often mocked religious tendencies. My only experience with religious people was the crazies that would stand on boxes screaming Bible quotes. As time passed, I became more and more atheistic and began to believe that religion was no more than a tool to control the masses. The idea that religion was for crazy people was reinforced on September the 11th, 2001. I recall watching the news very intently and being shocked at what I was seeing. How could anyone do this? How could anyone go so far? At this point, I was certain there was no God, and continued to live my life as such. From here, I went headfirst into a materialistic lifestyle. I worked and saved money so I could spend it on material things. I smoked weed, obsessed over girls, spent thousands on clothes and aftershaves. I became a social chameleon with many different groups of friends from diverse social groups. My life was just work, then play, work, then play, work, then play. Eventually, I made some new friends who were Muslim, and this led me to engaging more and more with religion. After reading the Quran and engaging in many discussions with them, I temporarily moved away from hard atheism and became more agnostic for a time, but still found it difficult to let go of my distaste for religion. I think at one point I may have even said it's very possible that a God exists, but I didn't see myself committing to a religion like Islam at the time, because there were too many restrictions and it was very controversial. I had lots of things I wanted to do, and being a Muslim would be something that would completely get in the way of that, so I never took the step. I continued in my materialistic ways, but couldn't ignore how pointless it all felt. Science fascinated me, and I loved watching shows like Through the Wormhole, which only increased my appreciation of the beauty and vastness of the universe, while at the same time realizing my own insignificance. Life continued to have its ups and downs. I, and the people around me, continued to go through difficulties, suffering, pain, and trauma. I read the news about all the crazy things that were happening around the world. I couldn't help but keep asking, what's the point of all this? Life was monotonous, and my depression crept in like a dark cloud. I was increasingly dissatisfied with life, and no number of worldly things offered any solution. I became ever more uncomfortable around my friends. Life was repetitive, frustrating, and boring, so I decided to run away. I saved up as much as I could and went traveling around Asia for 18 months. I sold all of my belongings and owned nothing other than my tiny backpack and its contents. In this time, I stayed and worked in several Buddhist temples, met people from all over the world from every religious background, and got into many discussions about the meaning of life, death, God, and religion. I had no obligations and no place I needed to be. When I got bored or sick of a place, I'd pack up and leave. For 18 months, life was a constant adventure. I lived on a tropical island and ran a bar, worked with wild animals like tigers, lions, and bears, went to full moon parties, wild camping, scuba diving, and couch surfing. I lived more in these 18 months than I had done in my entire existence before that. As amazing as all these experiences were, it wasn't enough to keep the nihilism I had been experiencing at bay. Paradise could quickly turn into hell in the blink of an eye. I could fall in love with a place, and in 1 minute, it would quickly reveal its hidden dark underbelly. I witnessed many terrible things and spoke to some terrifying people. The complexity of life and the world gradually revealed itself to me in more detail. I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly. I was struggling to make sense of it all. I had all this information in my head about all these different belief systems and opinions about what the purpose of life was. That is, if it had any purpose. I was struck with a sudden realization. There is just too much information. There was absolutely no way I could sift through all of this and process it all before I died. So, I surmised, if there was too much to process for all of mankind, how could I ever imagine I could do this by myself? There was too much chaos, too much flux. 1 minute, someone would seem like a great person. Next minute, you find out something very dark about them. Or you witness or become victim to something dreadful. Another time you meet someone terrible, only to find out they're going through some great difficulty, which forces you to feel empathy for them. Just when you think you have something understood, something else happens to completely shake the confidence you had. Eventually, my savings dried up, and I had to return home. The depression slowly began to creep back in. I had spent so long in a certain mode of being, with no commitments and no responsibilities, only to be thrown back into the normal world again. I found it difficult to acclimatize, and eventually fell into severe depression and suffered from acute social anxiety. I had plenty of friends, but cut them all off. I deleted my social media and withdrew into a shell. I watched documentary after documentary and witnessed over and over what the worst of humanity could do. I was exposed to dark corners of the internet, where I saw humans doing terrible things. I couldn't help but ask, what on earth is going on? What is all of this for? What's the point? In my isolation, I slowly and gradually sank deeper into an abyss. I was in its grip. And at its deepest point, when my life seemed the darkest, and I felt completely alone with my thoughts and pain, unable to communicate or share it with anyone, I recalled many of my discussions with people around the world about religion and God. In a moment of desperation, I prayed to something I wasn't even sure existed. I asked generally, to whatever is out there, whatever it is that's in control of all of this, whatever it is at the very top of existence, for help and guidance. I wasn't quite sure which God I was praying to, or whether he, or it, or whatever it was, could hear me, but I prayed nonetheless. My godless state had taken me to an abyss of utter meaninglessness. There was a conflict inside of me that did not make sense, between my need for meaning and the apparent inability of the world to offer it to me. I remember in my darkest moment, it felt like my identity melted away. All the things I thought I was, all my achievements, all dissolved. I was left as nothing, as a nobody. Reality had sunk in. I was no one special. My life was nothing significant. I had no allegiance to anything. My only concern at this point was truth, and I had lots of questions. I began my journey through the different major religions again. I investigated Buddhism, a religion I was very fond of, and continued to go to Buddhist centers in Manchester. I read about the life of Buddha and his teachings, amongst other things, like practicing meditation. I also investigated Hinduism and New Age spiritualists like Ram Dass, Eckhart Tolle, and many others. I was becoming more and more open to the ideas of spirituality, and had some minor experiences that began to make me more skeptical of the atheistic/agnostic mindset. I felt myself making a transition. I'll be honest, Islam was not at the top of my list. It was an incredibly controversial religion, and the idea of being a Muslim felt like too much effort. However, I wanted to give each religion a fair shot, so I began to read the Quran again and investigate the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions. I was reading books, watching videos, and listening to talks. At this point, I invested all my time into these things, and just exposed myself to as much information as I could consume and process. The more I did this, the more I became convinced of Islam above everything else. This was frustrating for me because it was scary. I could probably have entered any other religion and not have gotten much grief about it, especially when I was dabbling in Buddhism. People didn't seem to have a problem with that. But Islam was different. Islam receives a lot of negative media attention, and Muslims have a bad reputation. The thought of having to tell people I had become among this group frightened me. It would have been incredibly convenient if I could just find a reason, any reason, to consider it false. Then I could avoid all the controversial conversations, avoid all the commands about halal and haram, avoid the obligations of prayer and fasting. If I could just follow something easy, like Christianity or Buddhism, where for the most part, there isn't really any obligations beyond what I fancy. That would have made life so much easier. However, the more I investigated, the more I became convinced of Allah's existence, of the oneness of God, of the divine authorship of the Quran, and of the prophethood of Muhammad ﷺ. The more I went over it in my head, the more I confirmed it to myself that each one of these propositions had a big tick next to it, and that I found the counterclaims in other religions or ideologies to be unsatisfactory in comparison. I was essentially a Muslim in belief, but I found it difficult to take that step to expressing that belief outwardly. The more I thought about it, the sillier I felt. I was all too familiar with death, and knew my end could arrive at any moment. What would I say to Allah if that day arrived? and I did not testify to the truth and take shahada. If I am asked if I believe in his existence, in the Quran, in Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, my answer to all these questions would be yes. But what would my answer be when I am questioned about why I did not submit and become a Muslim? Upon reflection, I had to admit that the ultimate reasons would be because I was a coward and feared what people would say to or about me. I was lazy and did not want the commitments involved. I was a fool and couldn't see my beliefs through. What kind of excuse would this be? It became clear to me that to fear and love the world and the things it contained more than Allah was foolish, especially considering at this point I believed in it. So, I declared my testimony of faith and became a Muslim. I kept it secret for many years while I continued my journey of seeking knowledge. I studied with scholars, I read books, I went to university, and continued to engage in dialogue on the subject. With each passing year, I became increasingly convinced, strengthening my convictions even more. I was also amazed to witness how it completely turned my life around. Whereas before I was falling into a sense of nihilism, now it seemed impossible to be held by its grip. Islam had successfully filled my life with meaning and purpose that was unmatched by anything I had ever experienced. Everything I ever went through had a purpose to it, good or bad, and all that really mattered was how I dealt with it. Islam offered a guidance and a way of being. It helped me understand right from wrong and gave clear restrictions from the many things that harmed me in my youth and many of the others who were around me. It gave me structure and discipline, and it helped me to develop knowledge and a connection with Allah. The more I learned about Him and His religion, the more I loved Him. Eventually, establishing the prayer became easy for me. If I ever miss a prayer, which is rare, I feel like I have lost something precious. I get excited for Ramadan. I have love for people and have formed amazing bonds with them after such short periods of time, simply because we share a love for Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Islam gave me brotherhood and a community to be a part of. It gave me my life back. It was like life was without color, and then suddenly, I could see all the different hues and vivid brightness. My depression all but vanished, and my passion for life and engaging with people was reinvigorated. Where once I was sinking into an abyss, consumed by nihilistic tendencies, Islam had freed me from that. It was strange, because I still suffered. I still experienced loss and pain. But now, there was a sweetness that accompanied it. There was a reason for all the difficulties in life, and as down as I feel sometimes, I never lose hope. I hold firm to the rope of Allah, above the abyss. My studies at university were in philosophy, and my dissertation was about nihilism and the meaning of life. I spent a long time grappling with the works of Nietzsche and other existential philosophers who spoke about this subject in depth. I began to develop my insight into the issues that gave rise to nihilism on a societal level, and the consequences of it having its grip on a people. Having experienced it on a personal level, and spoken to many people dealing with the same issues, it has become a topic close to my heart. I took it upon myself to try to contribute towards helping people overcome nihilism. I believe Islam is the answer to this, and in this book, I wish to demonstrate how that is the case. Introduction. In this work, I intend to make clear a few of the motivating factors that give rise to nihilism and its consequences. I then hope to direct the reader to practical solutions, which will help keep nihilism at bay, or alternatively, point towards a path which will help those who already suffer from it to overcome it. I will do this in multiple stages. I will begin by focusing mainly on addressing nihilism as a sickness. The latter part of the book will focus more explicitly on Islam as a solution to nihilism and overcoming obstacles, and accepting it genuinely as an antidote. I will take the following steps. First, I will define nihilism. I will explain why the subject of nihilism is an important one, and why it should be at the heart of our concerns. This issue is very much neglected, and it should be getting our careful attention. Upon establishing the importance of the issue, I will elaborate on its relation to higher values, which are typically upheld by a society. Through this, I hope to give the reader a clearer understanding of the issues at hand, and a framework with which to better follow the discussion throughout the rest of the book. Furthermore, once I have shown that the possibility of nihilism opens through the collapse of certain collectively held higher values, I will be able to transition into giving a particular example of when nihilistic deterioration occurs, with specific attention given to the concept of truth. I intend to outline how valuing truth in a particular way can lead to undermining the value for truth completely, and therefore lead a society into what is referred to as a post-truth era. I hope to demonstrate how the transition from the former era to the latter allows for conditions to arise which lead to a societal mental exhaustion, which in turn leads to an increase in forms of escapism to avoid having to face the burden of consciousness. That is, the burden of having to face up to the difficulties of life, the suffering it entails, the task of figuring out what it means to live, what is going on in the world, and where you fit into all of this exactly. I will explore how these forms of escapism are overabundant in our society, how it overwhelms us, and therefore, how we become mentally paralyzed and incapable of making any genuine internal progress. Nihilism is an individual sickness, as well as a collective disease, that we are all having to face either directly or indirectly. These threats to meaning are present, whether we like to think so or not. Turning a blind eye to the conditions that I will be outlining does not make them go away, nor does it resolve the issue. It only makes it worse. We must face it head-on by first recognizing its existence. Only then can we attempt to overcome it. This sickness will be diagnosed and an antidote prescribed. The symptoms of this sickness will be assessed and outlined, looking first at the effects of nihilism on ideas and thinking. Technology and scientific advancement are often praised as a way in which we will transcend many of these issues. However, I wish to show that counter to this opinion, technological advancements, rather than being something to praise, can be seen as facilitating this escapism through what is termed techno-hypnosis. I will then move on to look at the effects of nihilism on people and society. I will identify issues arising out of the lack of a collective societal aims or goals, and how this increases the societal fracturing we are currently experiencing throughout the world. All these problems have a necessary effect on how we think about many areas of life, including politics, morality, moral duty, and meaning. I intend to explore and highlight all of this in an approachable way for the average person to be able to digest and understand. I will ascertain how many people try to flee nihilism by picking and choosing elements from many different religions they find useful, while paradoxically rejecting religion as backwards or dogmatic. That is, I wish to show how the nihilist, whether they know themselves to be one or not, as much as they push religion away, do not actually escape religiosity. They try to belittle such concepts as faith, yet are caught repeatedly making numerous leaps of faith themselves. From here, we will move to the latter part of the book, which has two aims. Firstly, to remove common obstacles that might get in the way of someone taking religion seriously. And secondly, going over exactly how Islam acts as a solution to the causes of nihilism and the cure to its effects. With regards to the obstacles, we will discuss the question on whether we should be believing in the divine, what the evidence is exactly, how to overcome the problem of multiple gods/religions, the essence of traditions, and the concept of faith and its inevitability. I will also ask the reader to take a leap of faith with me, but I will not give too much about that right now. When discussing how Islam deals with the causes and the effects of nihilism, we will go through each of the things we have raised in earlier parts of the book, and referring to Islamic scripture to show how these two positions are incompatible, and that if you embrace Islam and believe in it, you can expect to resolve these issues completely. Part 1. Beginning to understand nihilism. The philosophy of nihilism. The human being is driven by many needs, such as sustenance, shelter, and community. But we are also heavily driven by purpose. Insofar as nihilism is the explicit denial that life has any purpose, it is necessarily so that nihilism denies our humanity. This has the danger of expressing itself in a variety of ways, and so to avoid its consequences, we need to work hard at understanding it intimately. Nihilism can come in many forms, but generally speaking, it can be described as the rejection of all meaning, purpose, and the disintegration of traditional morality. David Matheson defines nihilism as maintaining that no lives are, all things considered, worth living. And Ralph Donaldson further describes a particular form of nihilism as holding that life is somehow meaningless, hollow, and again, not worth living. As we can see from these descriptions, nihilism is not an optimistic worldview, but a pessimistic one. Friedrich Nietzsche, who is considered the father of the philosophy of nihilism, adds to this concept by saying that there is no goal, no answer to the question, why? And further builds on this by saying, what is the significance of nihilism? That the highest values devalue themselves. The feature of not having a goal and of the highest values devaluing themselves will be one of the central subjects of the first part of this book. Before I continue with this, however, it is important to understand why nihilism should be of interest. Not just to me, as is hopefully clear after reading the preface, but also to you. The importance of nihilism. It is crucial that we clarify exactly why it is we should care. Why should we spend our time looking into it at all? The reason I say that your concern is necessary is that the feeling of nihilism will very possibly strike you at some point in life, if it has not already. However, if you are blessed enough to never be affected by it, the chances are that at the very least someone you know and love will. Alternatively, you may not know that you have been affected by it, because the word nihilism is a strange one that you may not be familiar with. It is not often heard by the average person or brought up in day-to-day conversation. It may very well be the case that upon reading this book, you come to realize that you have in fact experienced nihilism, but you just did not know there was a philosophical term for it. In any case, I wish to convince you that it is important, and that it does require our attention, not just mine alone. I wish to convince you that if we fail in this regard, people's lives, and potentially their afterlife, are at stake. The philosopher Albert Camus, in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, opens his book by saying, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide." The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who was well known for his pessimism, made some antinatalist remarks which follow this anti-life theme. which is the notion that life is just not worth beginning. Never mind living. Although this certainly is not to say that he is promoting suicide as an answer, he does state quite clearly that we should not even bother bringing life into existence. If children were brought into the world by an act of pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist? Would not a man rather have so much sympathy with the coming generation as to spare it the burden of existence? Or at any rate not take it upon himself to impose that burden upon it in cold blood? Schopenhauer's work was a massive influence on Nietzsche, and it was most definitely a contributing factor to the work he produced on pessimism and nihilism. However, we cannot lay the development of these ideas only at the feet of these two philosophers. You could argue that it is the many philosophical ideas themselves that have been littering the field of philosophy, which have slowly evolved into nihilism, therefore giving rise to this anti-life sentiment, expressed through either antinatalist, suicidal, or both. This theme has built momentum over the years, and you see its fruition in the sheer numbers of people that are ending their lives today. The World Health Organization released an article stating that close to 800,000 people end their lives worldwide every year, and for every successful suicide, there are many more failed attempts. To put this into perspective, this is like finding out that every year a city the size of Leeds in the UK has ended their own lives, and a number of other cities of a similar size, 2 to 4 of them, have attempted to do so but failed. This is a clear sign of the prevalence of severe unhappiness, and that life is considered not worth living for a very large number of people. On top of this, you also have people who consider it, desire it, but do not attempt to end their lives, possibly out of fear of it going wrong or being painful. But in any case, they still consider life not worth living to warrant desiring to take such drastic action at all. Furthermore, data quality and collection methods are lacking in many countries around the world, so these figures might in fact be much worse than the data we have at present suggests. Nonetheless, the figures as they stand are still very high, and this is concerning. Lastly, the connection between this problem of suicide and depression and the issue of nihilism is the idea that life is either meaningless, without purpose, or not worth living at all. In Martin Heidegger's book, Being and Time, he outlines the idea that what makes Dasein, roughly speaking the human being, distinct from other beings is that its very existence is an issue for it. That is, unlike other beings, the human being must decide what kind of a being it is going to be. The human being must decide how to be. Will this person decide to work towards being an engineer, an artist, a lawyer, a doctor, or a philosopher? It must project itself into the future, set goals, and work towards attaining these goals. The human being drags the ideal out from the realm of mind and into the world, into reality. Other beings do not have to concern themselves with such things. The lion, the bird, the fish, and the insect do not need to figure out how to be. They just are what they are, and they just do what they do. There is very little room or reason for an existential crisis. The human being, on the other hand, could have everything they desire and have attained all earthly needs and wants in abundance, yet still become depressed and suicidal. The human being cannot help but ponder over the meaning of life. We strive for purpose not for the sake of it, but because it is an integral part of our very being. This is why the issue of nihilism is important, and this is why we should be concerned with it. Nihilism's relevance to goals and values. Let me begin by explaining what a value is, and then by giving an example that explains how the highest values undermine themselves, as this is often a source of confusion for those first hearing it. When talking about value, what is meant is something which is considered of relative worth, utility, or importance. We can talk of material things having value, but we can also talk of ideas or principles having it too. When talking about higher values, what I am referring to are the principles or standards which individuals or collectives hold as the most important. So important, in fact, that they feel they have a duty to maintain or uphold these for themselves and their society. They are what a community considers as the most important things, and can be what unites them as a people, or what they collectively consider to be of great worth and utility. Religion is a great example of this. In the Muslim world, Islam, that is, the worship of and submission to God, is the highest value. To an atheist, maybe secularism or personal liberty is the thing that should be valued the most. These higher values can be expressed in a multitude of ways, depending on the people and context. You can visualize it as a pyramid, with the most important things/ideas being at the top, and the least important at the bottom. A higher value undermining itself. You may find an example of a higher value undermining itself within the Christian West concerning the idea of truth. Truth was made a higher value to the point that it began to undermine the very foundations that gave rise to the value in the first place. But how did it become a higher value? Prior to Christianity, Europe was mostly polytheistic in its worship, dedicating themselves to multiple gods. Now, although there certainly were instances of the gods acting truthfully, there were also examples of them acting in very questionable ways. The Greek god Zeus, for example, is notorious for raping women. There are also numerous examples of lying by both the ancient gods and heroes of the past. There was such an emphasis on cheating, lying, and deception in ancient polytheistic religions that Socrates himself, in Plato's Republic, had to discuss censoring them for this very reason. In the preliminary writing to the chapter, the following was stated as a commentary by the editor on what was to follow in Plato's dialogue. It must also be remembered that the Greeks had no Bible, and what the Bible has been to us as a source of theology and morals, poets were to the Greeks. And if Plato seems very preoccupied with the morals and theological aspect of the poets, it is because it was from them the ordinary Greek was expected to acquire his moral and theological notions. This issue was notably something the ancients had to deal with, as pantheons of gods in ancient religions always contained a plethora of different characters, many of whom were at odds with each other. Socrates despised these stories so much, due to their nature and the problems that I have alluded to here, that he said, "And they shall not be repeated in our state, Adamantus, nor shall any young audience be told that anyone who commits horrible crimes or punishes his father unmercifully is doing nothing out of the ordinary, but merely what the first and greatest of the gods have done before." Socrates is one of the most well-known and well-respected Western philosophers in history, and he was quick to point this problem out. Now, with the rise of Christianity, a solution to this problem became present in the Bible. Lying became an abomination to the Lord. On the other hand, those who act faithfully are his delight. In another part, the believer is commanded to become a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. Truth became a central emphasis of the doctrine, and followers were warned of severe punishment for going astray. Unlike the previous religions, where the many gods acting in abhorrent ways opened the potential for this to be justified, Christianity warned that a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who breathes out lies will perish. truthfulness became present as an explicit command by the highest value, God. Because of this, his commands were necessarily to be valued above everything else as well. However, with what Nietzsche referred to as the death of God, the loss of faith, in the Western world, motivation for this moral underpinning was also lost. With that, their justification and their foundation to the ability to claim that something was good absolutely was taken away from them. Their valuing of truth became free-floating, as it were, and it was assumed to be self-evident. However, philosophy is known for leaving nothing unquestioned. It explores everything and leaves no stone unturned. Eventually, the false assumption that truth is a necessary higher value in a secular/atheistic world, held independently from the commands of God, who they no longer had faith in, began to crumble. This becomes especially evident when people became more focused on worldly things and began to be more concerned with philosophical ideas like utilitarianism. When values are being rooted in sensations like pleasure and pain, this becomes a paradigm through which truth itself can potentially be seen as an evil, necessarily. If truth ever happens to get in the way of the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people, what motivation remains to value truth? If it happens to be the case that a grand lie is best suited for providing such an end, truth can very quickly be abandoned for something more satisfying. However, this is not something that would occur overnight. Christianity has been around for so long that its moral system has become somewhat ingrained into the very foundations of Western society, and many of its moral axioms are taken for granted.